I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where it was hard for you to catch your breath. Growing up playing sports and now coaching little kids soccer, there's been moments where you take a soccer ball to the stomach and you literally cannot breathe. You feel like you're never going to breathe again. My 7-year-old boy, he likes to run down our hallway and leap onto his bed. And that's always fun, right, until he gets hurt. And so just about a week and a half ago, he runs and he's done it over and over, and he hits the bed and he flies off the other side. And he immediately, if you're a parent, there's kind of two kinds of cries. There's the one cry and you're like, okay, he's okay, right? You know that cry, it's good, you hear him crying. And then there's the kind of cry where they begin to cry and then they just stop. And so that was the moment. And so I run in there and he's, I can't breathe. And that is a scary moment, right? When you feel like you're not going to catch that next breath. I can remember on a mission trip to Nashville when I was the youth pastor here, and one of our students who has asthma, we were playing a game, and she gets to this moment where she has an asthma attack and literally cannot catch her next breath. And luckily my wife, who is a nurse, was with us and was able to take care of her. But that is a scary moment when you feel like you can't take a breath. And so as I begin to think about what we're going to talk about today, I think there's many of us who are living these kinds of lives where it's constantly going to the next thing. We're overworked, we're overstretched, and we feel like we just can't catch our breath. Right? There's just no breathing room to our lives. Right? We're just moving constantly from one thing to the next, and for many of us, we're like, I just need to sit down. Right? I just need to be able to take a breath. Some of that's on your own decisions. You have put yourself in places where you have kind of overcommitted. Some of you just say, well, that's just the industry I'm in. It's my job. I just have to work nonstop. I can't find those breaks. It's just the season. I have small kids. That's where I'm at. And you've made decisions, and you get to a point where like, I just need room to breathe. I just need to be able to pause. And for many of you, that's this space where you can come on a Sunday morning and you can kind of step away and you can kind of find that moment where you're able to breathe. And it's interesting that God has something to say about this. It's actually one of the 10 Commandments. It's kind of interesting to me. It's interesting to me that God is going to speak about something like this, and then here in just a couple weeks, he's going to talk about not murdering people. I mean, just think about that. He's going to talk about us finding rest, of stopping, in the same breath as not murdering, not stealing. There's an importance to this. This is a spiritual thing. Now, as we talk about this, and I'm going to use the word Sabbath here in a few moments, I think you might have an idea of what Sabbath looks like. And so I want to make sure that we're on the same page, that we understand what was happening. Why was this important? Why does God instruct us to do this? And then I'm going to try to give you some really practical tips on how to make this happen in your own life. So just a really quick update. So we're in this series called Be Free, and we're looking at the 10 Commandments. We're looking at rules. We're looking at these instructions that God gives us, these laws. And many of us don't like rules, and we're trying to get away from rules when it comes to our relationship with God. But we understand rules are different when they come from a loving Father. They're different when they come from a loving Father who cares for us. And we see God as this loving Father who cares deeply for you. He says, I don't want you just to be set free. I don't want you just to be forgiven for your sins, but I really want you to actually live free. So what does that look like to live free? And so he's giving these instructions to a group of people who have just come out of slavery. For 400 years, that's all they've known. So their ancestors, this is the only stories that have ever been told for them is this life of slavery. And then God miraculously sets them free. But they're still not living free. And so God calls Moses up to a mountain and he gives them these 10 commandments. And these commandments are for you and for me and for us to figure out what it looks like to be free. So the first week we looked at no other God, and the next week we looked at not creating idols, right? So those two have to do with not putting anything before God, not finding our worth or our satisfaction, not looking to someone or something to tell us who we are. That we will worship no one or nothing but God. And then last week we looked at this idea, okay, this is who we're worshiping. Well, how do we worship? And one of those is by not taking the Lord's name in vain. And I said that's not just saying certain words, but it's taking the weight out of the name of God. That we understand that the name of God carries this weight. and his worth, his majesty and his glory, all the words that you can think of. That is in God's name. And so when we live certain lives, when we claim one thing but live another way, we're actually taking his name in vain, that we're emptying him of his worth. And so this week, we're going to look at this idea of Sabbath. So if you don't own a Bible, there should be a red Bible around you somewhere. We'd love for you to take that. That's our gift to you. The page numbers on the screen will be for that Bible. So we're going to read Exodus 20, starting in verse 8. Exodus 20, verse 8. It says this. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So just quickly, let me pull out a few words in here that maybe they're new and you may not know. So just right there, the word holy means set apart. That it's a distinct day, that there is a reason that we recognize what it is. But the word holy means to be set apart. And then Sabbath is almost like this word like intermission. If you think of a play, you watch the first act, right? I think that's what it's called. You watch the first act, and then there's this pause. There's this resting period. And so the word Sabbath literally means that, to rest, to pause, to find intermission. And so the instruction is that you work for 6 days. And then there's got to be this day where you pause, where you find intermission and you find rest. Now, for a lot of rules and a lot of laws, and if you can think about this as a parent, we just give rules or we receive rules, but oftentimes we're not told the why, right? I mean, if you have little kids, the question why comes up all the time, and the easy answer is because I said so, right? That's the easy go-to. I'm your dad, and I said so, and that's the reason why. Do we need to go any farther? But honestly, the why matters. The why matters. So why does God do this? Why does God give this instruction? And here's why I believe he gives it to us. For many, for the Israelites, for 7 days they were a slave. For 7 days they made bricks. Their worth and who they were tied up completely on what they produced. And what they produced. If they did not produce enough, if they couldn't work, then they were often killed. Who they were completely tied up in what they did. But God gives this instruction to the Israelites, and he basically says, look, you're not a slave anymore. You're not a slave anymore. You are free. And so when God says, look, you're going to work 6 days and you're going to take 1 day off, it's a reminder that you're free. That no longer do you have to fear slavery. No longer do you have to fear Pharaoh, who is going to punish those who are no longer able to work. Now, the temptation when it comes to work, though, is that can become our idol. We talked about that week 2, right? It can become our idol, and our work can tell us who we are. If we succeed, if we do well, then we find our worth in that. And so we can actually worship our job. We can worship that. And so there's this balance here, because I want you to hear that God, in this instruction, there's kind of 2 parts. That God is also saying, you need to work. You need to produce something in your life. That you have been given gifts and talents. And so there's this expectation that you will produce something with your life. That we're not just to exist. We're not just to sit on a couch and do nothing. Now, this looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. And so hear me, I'm not saying that if you're a stay-at-home parent that you're missing this, because you work extremely hard, and I know that. You're doing something. You're producing something. You're giving to your children, and you're giving yourself away. But I think we can err sometimes on this, and we become lazy. We become lazy, and we aren't contributing to what God has called us to do. So whether you're blue collar or white collar, whether you have a PhD or you had your GED, it doesn't matter if you're a working parent, stay-at-home parent, none of that matters. God has given you gifts and talents, and there's an expectation that you'll do something. Now, we kind of have it different in our country because we have 2 days off, right? There's this expectation that we work 5 days and we get 2 days. But when this was written, that wasn't the case. It was 7 days all the time that you were working. And so I know for many of you, that's how you're living. Maybe it's the industry you're in. Maybe you just feel like you have to do that to provide for your family, but you are living this every day. And so we begin to idolize this. We begin to idolize work, and so then we make sacrifices just like you would to another idol. We sacrifice our health. You can sacrifice family, your marriage, your children. You sacrifice community. You sacrifice your impact in a church body. We make sacrifices to this idol that we have. And so there's this balance. And so I want you to see today that your work is a way of worship. Your work is a way of worship. Your work isn't just something else you do to bring money home. It is an opportunity to worship. And so when you work, understand that the presence of God goes with you. No matter what field you are in, no matter what group you work with, wherever you go, the presence of God is with you. At school, the way you treat your teachers, the way you speak to a janitor, the way you serve and help out, that is a way of worship in the way you are a student. And so look, we don't separate the two. We don't separate work from worship. I actually think we could err and we fall back to commandment number 3 and we begin to break that commandment and we take the Lord's name in vain when we don't see that we live out our worship at work. And so this is the reason why God gives this, because it's very easy for us to begin to worship our work. It's very easy for us to find our identity in what we do, and so we idolize productivity. Whatever I produce is who I am, and God says, no. You become a slave to that. You are not living free when that is the way that you live. And so the Israelites have been set free from slavery, and you and I also are set free from this slavery. So he says you must take a day off. Here's what a Jewish writer says. He says, what does the Exodus have to do with resting on the seventh day? It's all about freedom. As I said before, in ancient times, leisure was confined to certain classes. Slaves did not get days off. Thus, by resting on Sabbath, or Shabbat is how they would say it, we are reminded that we are free. But in a more general sense, Sabbath frees us from our weekday concerns, from our deadlines, schedules, and commitments. During the week, we are slaves to our jobs, to our creditors, to our need to provide for ourselves and others. On Sabbath, we are freed from these concerns, much as our ancestors were freed from slavery in Egypt. This is a current writing. This isn't something that was written thousands of years ago. This is an Orthodox Jew now who is teaching other Orthodox Jews, look, when you take rest and you find rest, it is just like when our ancestors were freed from slavery. Moses in Deuteronomy, he's going to go over the 10 Commandments again. This is interesting. I don't know if it's a different group of people. I don't know if he's reminding those he is leading again, but in Deuteronomy 5:15, he says this. He says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. The first time he does the 10 Commandments, he didn't tie these directly together. The second time Moses says this, he ties together this idea of being free. And he says, you're no longer slaves. You no longer have to work 7 days. You work 6, you produce 6, and you work hard. But that seventh day is a reminder that God is good, that God has rescued you and he has set you free, and now you must live free. Because this is the Jewish custom, and this still happens today. Here's some of the things that they couldn't do on the Sabbath. They couldn't write, they couldn't erase, they couldn't tear anything. Still Orthodox Jews, this is how they look at the Sabbath. There's no business transactions, there's no driving or riding in cars or other vehicles, there's no shopping, there's no using the telephone, there's no turning on or off anything which uses electricity, including lights, radios, television, computers, air conditioners, alarm clocks. So on the night before Sabbath, they would prepare. This is important, and we're going to get to this in a minute. They would actually prepare for Sabbath. So if they knew they were going to need a light on the next day, they would turn it on the day before. If they had a refrigerator with a light on in the refrigerator when they would open the door, they would unscrew the light bulb so the next day when they opened the fridge, the light bulb would not come on. There was this preparation. They would prepare for their rest. There was no cooking or baking. There was no making a fire. There was no gardening. There's no grass mowing. There's no laundry. This sounds pretty good, right? My young people are going to use this later. Kyle said I can't do laundry. It's Sabbath, right? So there's this idea that it was so important, that it is so important to them to find rest and to be free, that they prepare for it. That they prepare for it. They know that they don't survive without it. Now, things have changed. I'm going to get to this in a moment. Things are changed, and it doesn't look the same way for us anymore. Why not? Well, we see that Jesus begins to do something different with Sabbath. Listen to this. It's in Mark 3, 1 through 6. It says, another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. You couldn't do this. That was work. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. There's a lot of stuff that Jesus is doing. And then he breaks the Sabbath in what they think he has done, that he has broken the Sabbath. But we know Jesus has never sinned. So we understand here that Jesus is beginning to live the Sabbath out differently. And so with our commandments, and we're going to see this as we move forward in the don't murder, Jesus is going to put something new to that. He's not abolishing it, right? The Bible says this, that Jesus comes to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, but it just looks different because of Jesus. And so we see here that Jesus is living out the Sabbath differently. I heard it said like this. I'll give you a little visual. Let's say Grandpa is out in the field and he falls. Right? He's fallen in the field, and like the old commercial, he can't get up, right? So Grandpa has fallen and he can't get up, and his family comes along. His family would not help him up because that is work. And they would come to Grandpa and they'd have to say, Grandpa, how bad is it? But are you bleeding? Are you going to survive? Can you wait till the next day? This is how strict the Sabbath was viewed. Right? Grandpa probably didn't have a say in this. Just those who had to figure out, is this work? And so like with a lot of rules, with a lot of laws, it can become legalistic. And so this is what happened over time. They thought, man, what are the things we can do and we can't do? And Jesus comes and says, well, is it better to do evil or to do good on the Sabbath? And he ushers in this kind of new teaching of the Sabbath. And this isn't the only time. We see it in other places. He's questioned about the Sabbath in Mark 2. And he says, look, the Sabbath was made to serve us. We weren't made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for you. The Sabbath is for you. It is for you to find rest. And so it doesn't take long. It's not hard to see. Look, our Sabbath is much different than the Orthodox Jews. Our Sabbath is much different than the way some other people look at it. And so two questions I've had when it comes to this is one, so is the fourth commandment still binding? Right? Do we still have to follow the fourth commandment? It feels different, does it not? I mean, if in a couple weeks when I say don't murder, you're going to be like, I agree with that one. I understand that one's still binding, but this one just feels different, does it not? Like, how does this still apply to our lives? If we aren't really doing what they used to do for the Sabbath, is it still binding for us? And so, again, it just looks different. Jesus even calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. He says in Matthew 11, come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will find you, and I will give you rest. So our rest no longer is just found in a day. It's found in a person. This is important. Our rest is no longer just found in a day that we observe. Our rest for the weary, rest for the brokenhearted, rest for those who feel bound by even religious duties. Our rest is found in Jesus, not just a day. So it's not how do we observe the Sabbath, but who do we observe the Sabbath for? And so it just looks different. It's like when you have a child. My daughter's about to turn 12. Rules for her at 12 are much different than rules for her when she was 2. Right? There were some rules for her at 2 that were totally binding, totally like, you have to do this. Right? There's some rules now where it's like, it's probably wise if you do this. This is for you. your best interest in mind if you follow this. And so many theologians, and as I read and study, I have a feeling, it's not that it's not binding, it's not that it's not important, but it's really seen as wisdom. Wisdom and law are two different things. There's moral law and ceremonial law when it comes to Orthodox Jews. And as you read the Proverbs, these are the book of wisdom, there's these things that are wise to do. Like, listen to this one. It says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Right? Listen again. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. This is wise. The writer's not saying it's a sin if you don't get counsel. What he's saying is if you want things to succeed, if you want your plans to succeed, it's best if you ask someone. And so it almost feels as Jesus comes and he fulfills the law, the Sabbath begins to take a different turn. And it now has become almost this wisdom literature, this wisdom law. It doesn't mean that it's not the same. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means it looks different because of Jesus. And so it may not be you have to take a day off, that the way we've seen in the past, but I think what God would say is you need to take a day off, that it's wise to take a day off, that you're not a slave to your job in your work. And so the second thing we then ask is, well, then what day am I supposed to do this, right? What day am I supposed to find Sabbath? I work some weekends, and so am I breaking this? Am I not being wise because sometimes I have to work on Sundays? But this again is when Jesus changes everything. So the Jews, and there's some other religious beliefs that Sabbath is on Saturday. But what happened with the early church is Jesus again changes everything, and he is raised from the dead on Sunday. And so that's why we're here on Sunday. That's why we worship on Sundays. That's why the early church, in Acts 20, we see that the early apostles, they're meeting on the first day of the week. Now, let me just, a side note, if you wonder if what we believe is true, if you kind of question Jesus and his resurrection, just listen to what the Jewish people did when they began to follow Jesus. They reoriented their life completely. You just heard me tell you everything they had to do. That would have been on Saturday. Now, because of Jesus, they took everything they did on Saturday and moved it to Sunday. This was real, that Jesus came and he lived and he died, and they saw him after he died. It was so real that they reoriented everything in their life around this truth. Just think about how crazy your Mondays are, right? No one loves Mondays. Not many people love Mondays. Can you imagine having to move your whole life, everything you normally do on Sundays, to Mondays? To go to your work and go to your business and say, look, I'm going to have to change. My new Monday is Tuesday. That would take a lot of work. And this is what a group of people did because they believed so much that this was true. That their faith was so strong that everything they did was oriented around this idea. And so I have to be honest, just my Sabbath is not Sundays, really. For me, it's you. I mean, I find rest in this, and I love being with people, but there's a part of this that's worked for me. This is what I do. And so am I breaking the commandment? Am I breaking the law? Am I not doing what God wants me to? Because for me, my Sabbath is Fridays. I take Fridays as my Sabbath, and I find rest on Fridays. So again, for most of us, this is our Sabbath day. This is our day that we find rest and we get rejuvenated and we remind ourselves that God is still in control, that I can step away from my job and it's not going to fall apart. I mean, it might fall apart a little bit, but maybe you need to set things up where it won't. Maybe you need to set things up where it's not about you and figuring out what that looks like. But we step away and remember, God is God and we are not. That he is control, and I'm not a slave to anybody. I'm not a slave to anything. And so we take time away. And so if it's Saturday, if it's Sunday, if it's today, great. If it's a day during the week because you have to work a lot of Sundays, I think this is where it's not about legalism. It's about being free and understanding that there is a day that we must take. So why? Let me give you some practical reasons why I think this is important for us. We'll go through these pretty quickly. Number one, if you want to take notes and you want to write these down. Number one, remember Jesus' work is better than our work. Remember, Jesus' work is better than our work. Other religions, other faith systems, they work to get back to God. They work to be saved. They work to be seen in the right way of whatever God it is that they believe. Ours is completely opposite. We trust fully on the work of Jesus, nothing that we do. And so when we step away and we understand our freedom is in him alone, we understand that his work is way better than ours. And that my worth and your worth is not determined by what you do. Listen to me, your worth is not determined by what you do. It is not determined by how much money you make. Your worth is determined because you belong to Jesus. The second thing, the reason why I think this is so important for us, is it allows us to spend time in community with God's people. Right? That we come together as God's people and we support and we encourage and we lift one another up. We gather together regularly, showing that this is important. Listen to this, Hebrews 10, 23 through 25, it says this: "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful." God is faithful. "And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Don't give up meeting together. He's saying this is super important what you do. When you come here on Sundays, the hope is that we're spurring one another on, that you're able to walk into this place and say, look, I don't know how I'm going to get through the next week. We pray for one another, and we love one another, and we encourage one another. That is the role that this body should play for one another. That we don't give that up, and we find rest here together. I hope that you didn't miss this. My prayer this week, Joe Strayhorn, who I had talked about, Joe passed away this week. And my hope is that everyone knew. We had to quickly do the funeral. His family was headed out of town. And I've talked about Joe before, and Joe became a member in 1939 here in our church when it was way somewhere else. And every time it moved, Joe came, and he was a part of the church. I did some math. He was a member of Trinity for over 4,000 Sundays. Just put that in perspective, over 4,000 Sundays that Joe didn't miss many. And he was in the military, he missed some, and these last few years it was hit and miss as he was sick. But I remember one day I was at a meal with Joe, and he said, I can't imagine not having Sundays. He said, I can't imagine people who just kind of bounce from church to church to church. He just saw this as something that was so important to his life. That gathering together, and just let me say this as your pastor, thank you for loving Joe. When Joe didn't have family here and he needed help, you all responded every time. Every time. In 36 hours, we pulled together a great meal, and Joe would have loved that. I even imagined him being with us yesterday. Joe didn't want to miss a meal, especially when it was with people. Right? But for Joe, it just meant everything. This morning of being together, he was encouraged by. So the Sabbath, this rest, us coming together, the writer says, don't give that up. It's too vital to your health. It is a reminder that you're free, that we join together. Another reason why it's important is because we mirror God's rhythm. We read this. Look, if God takes a day off, I think we can. Right? God creates, he speaks things into existence for 6 days, and on the seventh day it says he rested. He rested, and so we follow the rhythm of Jesus and of God the Father. We see Jesus taking naps. This is good news for many of you. This is a way of worshiping, right? I'm not joking. Like, for you to pause and to sleep and know that the world still exists as you are asleep, right? So today, I'm giving you permission to go home and to worship and to take a nap. Many of you already do that anyways, but I'm just giving you permission. There's this rest in knowing that God is still God, even when we are asleep. We stop ourselves, number 4, we stop ourselves from being Pharaoh. Listen, you can be your own Pharaoh. You can be this slave driver to yourself because you think your worth is found in this. But look, we destroy relationships. We destroy relationships. We don't get redos. I have been on this week as I've sat with Joe almost every day. We don't get redos. We don't get redos. At 92, Joe left this place pouring into people, not being driven by anything else. You're in your 20s once. You're in your 30s once. You're in your 40s once. We don't get redos. We don't get redos in our marriages. We have one chance at this. of pouring into it. With our children are young at one time. We don't get redos, and so we could become this slave driver, and we become a slave to something else instead of understanding what was really important in finding freedom. Your kids need you, your spouse needs you, this church needs you, your community needs you. The fifth thing, I think we do this because we enjoy the life God has given us. That the life God has given us can be fun. It can be enjoyable. I think about this moment when the children run to Jesus. It doesn't take long to see kids like adults who are fun, right? Who enjoy their presence. This was the picture of Jesus, that these children wanted to go to Jesus. And so we understand that when I am not bound to my job, when I'm not a slave to that, I have time to enjoy other things. I have time to enjoy people. So these are the reasons why we do this. A few tips that I'm learning myself. You work hard so you can rest. You work hard. It's like they prepared for Sabbath. Jewish, Orthodox Jews, they prepare for their Sabbath. I think we do the same thing. You work hard for 6 days so you can take that day off. You prepare for your day off so you can rest one. We work on our heart. This is a big one for me. It may be my Sabbath, it may be my day off, but sometimes I can't shut my mind off, right? And so I have to pray that God allows me to do that He'll help me do that. When some things come in my mind, I take out my phone and I write a note in my phone and I put it away, right? We prepare and then we work on our heart for our day of rest. We disengage. This is a big one, and this may be the hardest thing I'll say all day. Turn your phone off. If we want to talk about slavery, we can talk about the things that many of us carry in our pocket. We are a slave to that. What if someone emailed me? Has anyone checked my post? Did anyone like it? Did anyone comment? I got to return everything. We become a slave to our phone. And so if you want to find rest, put your phone away. When you go to a meal with people, lock your phone in the car. When I'm with my family and with my wife on Fridays, I try and always leave my phone in the car. There is nothing that is going to happen that I need to know right now. So I find rest and I disengage because I am able to turn my phone off even just for a little while. So plan it, daily Sabbath. Find a daily Sabbath. Find a time where you can pray, you can read, you can find some breathing room. Find a weekly Sabbath. What's the one day a week that you will not work? Now things come up and my day off was Friday, and with Joe passing, I worked on Friday. But I'm going to find a time to rest. I'm going to find a time to get away and to disengage from work. But find a weekly, and then find a season of rest. Vacation, take trips, take a 2-day trip with family if you can do that, even if it's inexpensive. But we find these seasons and months of rest as well. God's way is better. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Do we believe that God's way is better? That His instruction is better than what we are putting into place? That we are not human doings, but we are human beings, and we can find rest, knowing we are not a slave to anything. We're not a slave to anything. God has set you free, and so we are called to live free. Greg's going to come up and play the song that we end with. It is a declaration or a prayer or a commitment that we want to live this out, that we will no longer be driven by anything or anyone but God alone. So if you would stand with me, I'll pray, and then we'll close with this song. Father, would you help us on this? I know for just even a couple of people in this room, they'll hear this and it will be difficult. They're going to have to reorient their life. They're going to have to make some changes because of the industry they're in, because of the job that they have. This is going to be extremely difficult. So will you give them wisdom in this? Will you help them to figure out what this looks like to be free? To not be owned by anyone or anything, and that they may find rest in you? Would you give them the courage and the understanding of how to make this happen? Would you help some of my friends who maybe err on the other side, and maybe we're not producing, maybe we're not giving our best, maybe we're not using our gifts and talents in any area? Would you help us to understand that part too? Would you help us to work hard to the benefit of others? Will you help us to see that our work is a way of worship? And would you help us to rest in you, to be encouraged by one another? Father, I'm thankful that you're patient with us in this, that there's times where I fail, and you're helping me figure this out. And so, Lord, I pray that you continue to help me and my friends who are here today. God, we give you the honor, we give you the glory, we give you the praise for who you are and for setting us free. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.